Tasmania is shedding jobs and revenue. This week saw a massive write-down in expected Commonwealth returns to the state. As a result, it's anticipated next Thursday the Premier and Treasurer Lara Giddings will hand down another grim budget. Last year, the public service bore the brunt, around 1,700 full-time jobs going. Further cuts will add to a growing unemployment queue, which has jumped to 7.7%. The private sector is also hemorrhaging jobs that'll mean even less revenue to state coffers. The sluggish housing market is indicating just how bad the economy is performing.
The building sector is really a litmus test as to the health of the economy.
And it would appear to be pretty sick.
The figures are the worst that I've seen in the last decade. I mean, we're talking about in housing this year alone about a 25% drop in the number of new homes that will be built. So there'll be 500 new homes that won't be built this year compared to last year. Now that's a significant number of businesses that are not going to be able to continue to operate. A lot of manufacturers and suppliers that are going to feel that pain as well. So after the pain is finished today,
Paul Burnell has been in the housing game for 20 years.
We're 50% down on where we were last year.
He remembers what it used to be like trying to get subcontractors.
5 years ago, it was very hard to get quality bricklayers, carpenters and tilers, etc. At the moment, they're ringing us up looking for work and saying we're available to start straight away. We haven't had that for probably 6, 7, 8 years.
we've got the waterproofing happening here. Waterproof.
Mr Burnell says potential customers are frightened.
People aren't sure if they're going to have a job. Let alone next year, next week. The bank finance and valuers are being very conservative at the moment, hence the values aren't coming through on the properties.
Last month, Tasmania's unemployment level again increased. It's now 7.7%. It's the highest in the country and the highest in a decade. In the past year and a half, many joining the growing list of unemployed have come from the building and construction industry.
Could easily be 1,000 jobs we've already lost from our sector. When you're talking about a sector that employs over 20,000 people, 1,000 jobs isn't hard to do.
Michael Kirschbaum fears the industry hasn't seen the worst yet.
Well, during the 1990s, we went from 14,500 to 10,000. That was a contraction of almost a third. If we had a similar contraction, you're looking at 13,000 people instead of 19,000 people. That's your whole forestry industry wiped out in one go, and that was at its peak.
Mr Kirschbaum says the industry's been responsible for over a quarter of Tasmania's growth in full-time employment in the past decade.
So if we're doing poorly, you can guarantee that retail's doing poorly, you can guarantee that tourism's doing poorly, you can guarantee that a whole bunch of other sectors are doing poorly.
Michael Bartlett runs a catering firm and has felt the impact of the economic downturn. You have reduced staff?
In what, in the last...
In the past 2 years?
Oh, yes, we have.
It's meant a restructure of his business.
We need to deal with the softness in the Hobart economy, and that's what we've got to deal with, yeah.
Mr Bartlett says a significant impediment to business is penalty rates on public holidays.
We don't do some work now, we turn it away as much, but we've got people who want to work those days, and we've got customers wanting services on those days, but it's simply not economical to do.
The public sector has been on the receiving end of significant job cuts since last year's state budget because of plummeting revenues. That fall is set to continue, with the federal budget this week revealing a drop of $500 million in Commonwealth payments to the state in the next few years.
This means that the saving strategy that was launched last budget needs to continue, but perhaps 12 months into the process we really need to reflect on what's been achieved, what the costs have been.
The University of Tasmania's Richard Eccleston says being financially sustainable shouldn't be seen as an end in itself.
So we need to think about what is happening to frontline services. For example, the voluntary redundancy program, according to the mid-year updates, nearly 6 months old now, identified that nearly 1,000 jobs have been shed through voluntary redundancies. But in looking through those figures, around 700 came from the Education Department, and the sum total of 16 from Treasury and Premier and Cabinet combined. I mean, is that necessarily appropriate?
The public sector union acknowledges cuts have to be made.
I acknowledge that there are functions being performed by parts of the public sector that are just not priorities.
But Tom Lynch says they haven't been strategic.
They simply said to agencies, this is how much you have to save, you decide really where you're going to save it. And cutting across the board just means eventually everything fails, that's really where we're at.
To meet their budget for the past 12 months, he says Parks and Wildlife deferred their maintenance program.
You can't keep doing that, or you have to start closing walkways, visitor centres and, core infrastructure, wastewater treatment plants, jetties that tourist boats rely on.
While the cuts across health have been widely felt, Mr Lynch says the department's still well short of this year's $100 million target. In the media update, it was reported they'd be $20 million out.
Certainly the messages I'm getting is that they're considerably further out than the 20 million. I've heard a figure of 43 million, and the question then is whether they will have to find that next year.
So what could go in the public sector? He says there's waste in ministerial parliamentary support, particularly in the area of question time briefs, questions that might get asked of a minister in Parliament.
At the end of the day, real work is being put aside in order to prepare answers to questions that may or may not even be asked. Is it worth spending all that money on question time briefs when we can't provide basic services?
Another example is the recent $1 million appointment of international regional development expert Ernesto Ciroli to help timber communities rebuild.
That was a classic case. Department of Economic Development, I believe, should be able to develop a strategy for regional employment for activating our regional economies.
With plummeting revenue, there's unlikely to be any big ticket items in next week's budget. But Lara Giddings needs to find money somewhere, and a recent review of the electricity sector could be a godsend. The sale of Aurora's retail arm could provide cash and competition.
That could potentially raise $200 million that would need to be reinvested in capital or perhaps in some sort of fund to provide financial support to low-income households. But it's a very important part of electricity reform.
Thank you very much.
But reforms need to be implemented. Last year, the government trumpeted new planning laws as a way of boosting investor confidence.
Well, it is the most significant planning reform the state has seen in a number of decades.
We all celebrated, including the Premier and the Minister for Planning, we all celebrated the introduction of a single residential scheme. It's been the subject of many grand speeches and accolades in terms of what they've done in the planning regime. But the reality is that there are a number of councils that have just thumbed their nose at it.
Further frustration for the struggling housing sector, which was meant to get approval in 14 days instead of 42.
It was meant to be that if you built a standard home on a standard block of land, you didn't have to go through the rigmarole of going through the local planning system.
But Mr Clues says councils are insisting builders go through old council processes.
At some point in time, the state government is going to have to say either we're running the state or local government are running the state, but at the moment it's just a mess.